Hello everyone and welcome to Mountain Lake Journal. I'm Tom Hellick. Among the 46 high peaks in the Adirondacks is one named in honor of an explorer and surveyor who became a tireless advocate to protecting the Adirondack wilderness.
Colvin arrives in the Adirondacks at just a time when Adirondack history is about to undergo major changes. The tourist industry is going to explode after the Civil War, and the logging industry is going to take off at just the same time that he is coming up here. So he is witnessing the two major events in Adirondack history.
The Adirondacks was a vast unknown wilderness. People knew the names of the mountains. They had a general idea of what was what and where certain peaks and lakes were. But it wasn't all put together on a comprehensive map, or at least one that was adequate enough that somebody could come out of Albany and go on a visit to the Adirondacks. He realized that the only way to properly map the Adirondacks was to put the entire Adirondacks on the geodetic grid. In other words, latitude and longitude.
Verplanck Colvin was the one who documented how the forested slopes held water and released it slowly during the course of the summer, and that it was in New York State's best interest, if they wanted to keep the canal going, to keep the forests in the watershed of the canal as intact as possible so that the streams wouldn't dry up every summer. And the Erie Canal, being the icon of New York commerce, resonated with all the legislators, and that's how you got the original Forest Preserve Act passed in 1885.
He's not so much concerned that the logging has destroyed the Adirondacks, but he thinks logging will destroy the Adirondacks unless something happens. And so he's very concerned that what we have will be lost to ruthless, irresponsible, cut-and-run logging.
Colvin explains the remedy for careless logging to be the creation of an Adirondack Park or Adirondack Timber Preserve by the state in the interest of commerce and navigation, that the area should be set aside as a park for New York.
And you can watch the full documentary, Colvin, Hero to the North Woods, this coming Tuesday at 8 p.m. here on Mountain Lake PBS. And we are joined now by filmmaker Bill Killon and also writer-producer Tom Henry. Welcome. It's nice to have you both here.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
What was it that fascinated you about Verplanck Colvin?
Growing up in the Adirondacks, I was exposed to a lot of local history, and all through high school and elementary school. And then when I went to college, and I was getting more interested in the history of the Adirondacks, and he always popped up, his name would pop up. So eventually I found his writings. Those writings are amazing. They're adventure stories, and I thought in a film format, his story would be great.
And that's interesting. He was really inspired to do what he did by a book he read. What was he, 18, 19 years old when the lawyer and poet in Albany, Alfred Billingstreet, gave him a copy of the book that he had written about his adventures in the Adirondacks. And that really impacted Colvin.
Yeah, Woods and Waters. It was Street's writings that really inspired him to, go up there, and the lack of mapping in the Adirondacks was the thing that spurred him to keep going. He thought that, maybe that was something that he could do, is to take his experience surveying and his knowledge about science and create maps for the Adirondack Park.
And when he was up there, at that point, did he see examples of how the logging was really decimating the Adirondacks, and did that have a huge influence on him?
That was, I think, the tipping point for Colvin when he climbed Mount Seward in 1870. He could see that firsthand. The sides of the hills were clear-cut, and he could see that there was no end to that. That was just the beginning. And he genuinely loved the Adirondacks already at that point. He'd been up there for a few summers. He'd already climbed Marcy. He had the view. He had the big view. Clear cutting was not in his view. And I think it was such an unlikely story for him to pursue this as Well, from his poetic thinking and his poetic writing, to pursue it from that perspective and to try to sell his ideas to the state legislature to protect this area on that basis just wasn't going to work. So he was already looking for excuses at that point.
And was he one of the first to make it to the summit of Seward?
He was the first recorded ascent to Seward.
So he had a perspective that nobody else had really had up to that point, and so he could really see what was happening there.
Right.
And you mentioned selling it to the legislature, so he didn't think just going to them and saying you need to protect this wonderful vast wilderness in the northern part of the state was enough, because the state at that point was looking to sell the lands. They were in financial difficulty and looking perhaps to unload those lands, and so he thought he had to find another way to sell it to him, and he, by all accounts, successfully did that by saying that it had a direct impact on the Erie Canal.
He knew he was up against a big community of people with financial interest in the Adirondacks already. There was already a recreational aspect to the Adirondacks. Mining and logging were entrenched by the 1870s. It was especially in the eastern Adirondacks, the mining was a big deal. So he had to overcome that momentum to begin an environmental argument.
His argument was that the Adirondacks have a direct impact on the watershed of the northern part of the state, and that has a direct impact on the Erie Canal. That if you don't want your canal running dry in the summer and want to have adequate water, you should pay attention to this and protect the watershed that holds all this water.
A very valid argument, and the timing was perfect for that, because the Erie Canal, which I believe was built in 1825, it had expanded in 1870, so they needed more water to fill these deeper, wider canals. And then you have a dry year, and there's not enough water. And the business people, they have to have water in that canal at that point. That is the shipping hub across the state. It was a fairly easy sell after that to the business people. Maybe a little harder to get it through the legislature.
So he got them first, and then the legislature did go along and took the first step of dispatching him, hiring him to go and survey the Adirondacks.
Right.
He had some experience as a surveyor, but was this just an enormous undertaking? Did he really know what he was getting into and what he was about to do?
He knew he had to have a starting point. And the obvious one was the elevation of Lake Champlain at 100 feet above sea level. So he was poking around Crown Point and Westport and finding his starting point, and also realizing that he was going to have to end up 40 miles or more away on top of Mount Marcy at some point. And that's a mile difference, almost a mile, just in elevation. And then how do you get there? How do you get from Westport to the top of Mount Marcy? There's no road, and he has to do straight lines. He's meticulous in his surveying. He's not going to do it with a barometer. He's not going to do it with a compass because of all the iron in the hills. The compass is not going to give an accurate reading. He's going to level it. He's going to have big quadrangles. He's going to triangulate. So yeah, he must have known at some point as he was getting into this that this was huge. But I think that's what he wanted. He saw himself as an adventurer first, and as a surveyor second. The surveying was a tool that allowed him to explore the Adirondacks, to understand it for himself, and to pitch it as something to be preserved as a park. Different viewpoints can come to different conclusions based on his writings, but the one that won in the end was to create the forest preserve. People were not going to preserve this place on their own. It had to be a mandate of some type.